Now let's apply the three views to this crisis, right? So if we look first at the liberal view and we make that distinction between the extreme liberal view and the embedded liberal view, the extreme liberals, right, as they always do, would say this intervention by a government institution, in this case, a multilateral government institution, the IMF, and government, remember, it's composed of many governments, many-sided, multilateral government institution, because each representative on the IMF is a government representative, right? So it is government institution that is embedded into the global economy. The extreme liberals would say there shouldn't be any government intervention. And they would say when the government interferes, you get problems. In fact, it creates a hazard, a moral hazard, right? And so what the extreme liberals would say, by bailing out the IMF, by bailing out South Korea, was saying, you can be reckless and irresponsible. They were, in fact, it's almost immoral what they were doing. They're encouraging reckless and irresponsible behavior on the part of governments because they're saying, if you get into a crisis, we'll bail you out. Don't worry, the IMF will come and bail you out. So what's to stop future governments, right, from being reckless and irresponsible in their finances when they think the IMF can bail them out? So that's the definition of a moral hazard, encouraging this hazard, this problem, and encouraging this reckless and irresponsible behavior on the part of governments in this case, or investors in other cases. That's the moral hazard, right? Now, if you look at those tough IMF conditions, how painful it was that people had to live through those things. I mean, the last thing governments want to do is go to the IMF and ask for help because they know the conditions are going to be painful. There's a reason the IMF is called the lender of last resort, right? And so that's why, most people might have some issues with this extreme liberal view. It doesn't always make sense. The embedded liberals in particular would argue, no, come on. The IMF was created as an institution embedded, built into the global economy to make sure the global economy functioned well. And so yes, from time to time, if there's a financial crisis, the IMF will help that country temporarily, provide some financial assistance, expect to be repaid with interest, as the IMF always is. And the whole point of helping that country, helping South Korea's economy, right? Instead of having the South Korean economy collapse and potentially bringing down the whole global economy, let's help South Korea, get them back on the road to prosperity, and their growth will contribute to the global economy's growth. Everyone can benefit and prosper when a growing global economy. It's a win-win. That'll allow more exports from the United States to South Korea. That'll allow for more opportunities to invest in South Korea. Embedded liberals would see this as good for everybody, not just South Korea, but the whole global economy. So the IMF action in this scenario, in this interpretation, was intended just to prevent the crisis from getting worse. As we know, the economic nationalists have a very different point of view, different worldview, and they see the world in a zero-sum sort of way, winners and losers. And so they would say, now some economic nationalists in South Korea, for example, might say the US and the other group of five, right, those rich capitalist countries that have most influence in the IMF, they benefited from this. The most powerful nations in the IMF advanced their national interests. And that's how economic nationalists see this thing. They say a government's actions are intended to promote the national interests of their own countries. They're looking out for their own country's interests, right? And even if that hurts other countries. And so the IMF conditions that the IMF imposed, those benefited the US and the other G5 nations. Imposing condition that says, let's remove restrictions on foreign direct investment, allowed big investors from the United States and other European countries as well to come in and buy up prized assets. I mentioned in a previous segment, foreign investors bought Korean Airlines. And this is the story that was going around. Now, we can check this again and check to make sure this is correct, but this is the kind of criticism that economic nationalists made. They said, This allowed this foreign direct investment removal of that restriction, allowed foreign investors to come in and buy Korean Airlines for the price they would have paid for one 747 airplane. They bought the whole airline because in the midst of this crisis, some of Korea's prized assets, state-owned enterprises, they could be sold on the cheap. And the IMF forced South Korea to remove the restrictions on foreign direct investment. That contributed to the national interests of these advanced capitalist countries, the G5. That's why the IMF does what it does, right? Removing restrictions on foreign trade, another thing, right? So that would be the economic nationalist view of South Korea. And by the way, when I taught this case in South Korea, right, to senior South Korean executives, business people, they said that's why the IMF did it. It was just doing to help the U.S. take advantage of South Korea. So very much an economic nationalist point of view. Now, the structuralist view is a little different, right, because that's narrower. That says this group of five, these advanced capitalist countries, right, U.S., U.K., Germany, France, Japan, well, those countries, yes, they have the most influence in the IMF. They essentially, they have veto power over big decisions. Really, they have the dominant influence in the IMF executive board. Well, they did what they did in this case to promote not their broad national interests, but corporate interests of big companies that control the governments of these capitalist countries. The whole system was rigged to benefit the big corporate interests, right? And so the IMF is just a puppet of these big corporate interests in the rich capitalist countries, and the governments of those countries just do the bidding, right, of the big corporations. This is the very, right, I know this is oversimplified, but this is the Marxist view. As Karl Marx and Engels themselves said in the Communist Manifesto, the state, the government, is merely the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, just carrying out the orders of the dominant capitalist class. And that's what a structuralist would say about why the IMF did this. So if you look, okay, the IMF imposed conditions, remove restrictions on foreign direct investment, allow, foreign investors to come in and buy prized assets. Well, structuralists would see this not as promoting the national interests broadly of the big capitalist countries, but the corporate interests behind those governments in those capitalist countries. So they would see it, they would kind of look at the same evidence, but they would interpret it slightly differently, right? And so that would be how the IMF conditions benefited the G5. Now, in the case, there's a reference to Steve Appleton, CEO of Micron Technology at the time, and he was complaining, right? He's from the United States. That's a U.S. company based in Idaho. He was CEO at the time, and he said, you know what? Why is IMF bailing out the South Korean government? That's where some of Micron Technology's competitors are. And the U.S. government, my taxpayer dollars help finance money that goes to the IMF. We're contributing a lot of money to this IMF and the operations of the IMF. I think the IMF should be doing my bidding even more. So he was complaining that they weren't doing the bidding of big corporate interests like Micron Technology. So I thought that was an interesting aspect there. So in any case, so this is the idea. And the structuralists clearly have a very different point of view. Now, there's some other critics of this, what the IMF did in this instance. Martin Feldstein, a very famous economist, passed away recently at Harvard University, said, and it's interesting because Martin Feldstein, very much a liberal in the sense we use it in this class, very much a believer in free markets and in the IMF, but he's saying, did the IMF really need to demand that, South Korea restructure its whole economy? Did they need to impose all those tough conditions, removing restrictions on foreign direct investment? Wasn't this just a temporary lack of liquidity in South Korea? Couldn't they have given them a bridge loan? And this is another thing that Jeffrey Sachs, another liberal economist, believer in free markets, right, said, were all of these really mind-altering, structural reforms that the IMF imposed necessary? And again, this idea of the bridge loan. The IMF could have given a loan to the big foreign banks and said, don't demand repayment from the chaebol. from the South Korean banks right now because, they're going through a crisis. But the IMF chose not to do that. Instead, it chose to remake the South Korean economy in a more liberal sort of image. And these critics think maybe that was going too far. So I think that is interesting as well. So there's a lot of critics all around of the IMF and its approach, but the IMF would defend itself and say, we did these things to put South Korea's economy on the right track, and by doing that, we were setting them up to succeed in the future. So in the final video, we'll talk about the outcome. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention, to squeeze this in too, the moral hazard view, right? The IMF was just bailing out South Korea. That would encourage reckless, irresponsible behavior in the future. That's the extreme liberal view, and we have talked about that already. So those are the major critics of the IMF, and looking at the IMF from all of these major points of view. And now we can talk about the outcome. Oh, I'm sorry. I one last little point. I didn't mean. I forgot that I added this last point. Another major critic of the IMF, Joseph Stiglitz, famous economist, Nobel Prize winner in 2002 for economics, U.S. economist, and he wrote a famous book, Globalization and Its Discontents. And he also wrote a famous article with similar content, What I Learned at the Economic Crisis. And Joseph Stiglitz, for a time, was chief economist of the World Bank Group. And he was chief economist during this Asian financial crisis. He saw what was going on in so many of these countries. He saw the way the IMF was responding. And he said, you know what? I don't think the IMF needed to do it. He complained the cookie cutter approach, right? That they always did these things, imposed the conditions in such a standardized way, too harsh, essentially. So he's not saying that the IMF shouldn't exist. He's not a structuralist or an economic nationalist. I think he's an embedded liberal who just says, I think the IMF could do things maybe not so harsh, not demand so much, and not, ask for drastic cuts in government spending and high interest rate increases. Now, he, of course, has his own critics, and Kenneth Rogoff, who was chief economist of the IMF during the Asian financial crisis, at one point had a big debate. You can actually see videos if you search the debate between Kenneth Rogoff and Joseph Stiglitz when they were talking about this kind of issue, actually talking about Stiglitz's book, Globalization and Its Discontents. And Kenneth Rogoff was defending the IMF. And he said, what are you going to do? The IMF did these things, imposed these conditions to help South Korea in the midst of a crisis. Foreign investors were fleeing the country, pulling their assets out of the country. They had to raise interest rates to bring some of that money back, to stabilize the economy. They had to make some of these other changes. And maybe they made some mistakes, but the IMF's approach is more or less good. So there are these two different points of view out there. Both, I would argue, are embedded liberals who believe in the mission of the IMF. They just would have different ways of doing it. And so again, those are some other important critics of the IMF. So now let's turn in the next video to what happened. What is the outcome?